It was an ordinary Friday night at a small, dimly lit bar in downtown Los Angeles, the kind of place where locals gathered after a long week. The clinking of glasses, the hum of quiet conversations, and the soft strumming of a guitar in the corner set the atmosphere. Keanu Reeves sat alone at the bar, nursing a whiskey, his face relaxed but thoughtful. Dressed casually in a black jacket and jeans, he blended in as just another regular at the bar, far removed from the iconic action star the world knew him as. Keanu wasn't here for fame or recognition. Tonight, he just wanted a moment of peace, a brief escape from the noise of his public life. But as fate often works, even the smallest moments can shift into something unexpected. A group of young men at the far end of the bar started to notice him. They were loud, laughing amongst themselves, probably just a few drinks in. They weren't being malicious at first, just the typical rowdy behavior of young adults on a night out. But then one of them, a tall, brash-looking guy with messy hair, leaned toward his friends and pointed at Keanu. "Hey, isn't that Keanu Reeves?" he asked, his voice carrying across the room. "The guy from all those action movies?" The group quieted for a moment, recognizing the familiar face. Most people would have rushed over to ask for a photo or a selfie, but this group wasn't like most people. "What's he even doing here?" the guy continued, his voice louder now. "I thought celebrities only went to fancy places. Shouldn't he be at some expensive club or something?" Keanu's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't respond. He wasn't one for confrontation, especially not in public, not in a bar where he just wanted to be left alone. But the group didn't stop. They saw his silence as an invitation. One of them, a shorter guy with a sarcastic smile, stood up and walked over to him. "Hey, Keanu," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You slumming it here with the rest of us? How's the acting career going? Still doing those Matrix movies, or have you moved on to something more relevant?" Keanu glanced at him, his face still calm, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Was it frustration or just disappointment? The group of young men laughed, oblivious to the fact that their words might be crossing a line. Keanu, however, knew better than to react. He didn't engage with the taunts, didn't give them the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he slowly sipped his drink, trying to let the moment pass. But things weren't as simple as he hoped. Another guy, this one with a large tattoo snaking down his arm, stood up and joined the others. "What's the matter, man? Too good to talk to the rest of us? You think we don't know who you are?" He sneered, his voice growing more aggressive. Keanu's hand tightened around his glass, but he didn't look at the man. He knew where this could go. He'd been in enough public situations to understand the game. Someone pushes, someone snaps. But that wasn't Keanu's style. However, as the group continued to throw barbs his way, something shifted. The energy in the bar grew tenser. It wasn't just about Keanu anymore. Now it felt like an arena, with the eyes of every patron subtly shifting toward the confrontation. "Come on, Keanu, say something," one of them shouted. There it was, the breaking point. Keanu didn't respond, didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. He stood up, leaving his drink on the counter, and with a steady, almost calm demeanor, he turned to face the group of young men who had targeted him. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice low but clear. The words were simple, but they carried a weight that none of the young men expected. There was a moment of silence. The group of young men exchanged glances, not sure how to react. For a split second, the power dynamic shifted. They were no longer in control, and that was when the first real crack appeared in the facade of their bravado. What would you do if the world you thought you knew came crashing down? The bartender, having witnessed the entire exchange, leaned in toward a nearby customer. "This is gonna get interesting," he muttered under his breath as he wiped down the counter. Keanu wasn't just a man who had been put in an uncomfortable situation. He was about to change the course of the night in a way that no one would expect. The tension in the air was palpable, and the story, still unfolding, was about to take a turn that no one saw coming. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough? The following days after that fateful night at the bar seemed like any other for Keanu. He went about his routine, working on upcoming film projects, meeting with producers, and maintaining his usual low-key lifestyle. Despite the media frenzy that always surrounded him, Keanu had a way of staying grounded, avoiding the spotlight when he didn't need to be in it. But there was something about that night that stuck with him. The way the young men had taunted him, the sudden shift in power and his calm response, it felt like more than just a random incident. It was as if the universe had thrown him a curveball to test his own resolve, his ability to hold his ground without lashing out. Yet that evening kept creeping back into his thoughts. The quiet voice of the bartender echoing in his mind, the way the group of young men had backed down when they realized he wasn't going to react the way they'd expected. But it wasn't just about the confrontation anymore. It was about the bigger picture. Something had shifted inside of him that night. He found himself reflecting on the way people sought validation from others, how easy it was to let insults or mockery dictate the course of your actions. And for the first time in a long while, Keanu felt like something was missing, so he made a decision. He needed a change, a journey that would not only help him clear his mind, but also challenge him in ways he hadn't considered before. He would step away from his usual environment, away from the Hollywood scene, and venture into the unknown, something truly out of his comfort zone. It wasn't like him to seek out a challenge, but this felt different. He wasn't looking for fame or recognition. He was looking for something deeper, something personal. So Keanu packed his bag and booked a flight to a place he'd always been curious about, but never had the chance to visit, the remote mountains of Northern California. A place where he could disconnect, find clarity, and hopefully rediscover a part of himself that had been buried under years of public scrutiny. The flight was long, but the anticipation kept him calm. As he touched down in the small airport, the cool air of the mountains greeted him, fresh and free from the weight of city life. The moment he stepped off the plane, a wave of peace washed over him. It was quiet here, too quiet almost, but it felt like the perfect place to reset. Keanu rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any distractions. No cameras, no reporters, no fans, just the sound of nature. It felt almost surreal, being in a place where no one knew who he was. It was exactly what he needed. Days passed in peaceful solitude. Keanu spent his mornings hiking through dense forests, his afternoons sitting by a stream, watching the water flow by. The stillness allowed him to process his thoughts in a way that was impossible in the chaos of his everyday life. He thought about the incident at the bar, about how the confrontation had escalated so quickly and how easily it could have spiraled into something much worse. But most of all, he thought about the idea of humility, the way he had reacted to those young men, the way he had chosen not to engage in the battle they had tried to start. He had always tried to live by a set of principles: humility, kindness, and integrity. But somewhere along the way he realized that he had started to lose sight of what those really meant. The challenge of responding to insult with grace had been one thing, but it was the deeper question of whether or not he was truly living in alignment with those values. Was he just paying lip service to them, or had he truly internalized them in his heart? One afternoon, as he sat by the stream, he encountered an older man who had been hiking nearby. The man seemed to materialize out of nowhere, almost as if the forest had summoned him. He had a rough-hewn appearance, wearing a plaid shirt, boots, and a weathered hat, and a face that suggested he'd spent most of his life working the land. The man looked at Keanu, noticing his calm demeanor and the contemplative expression on his face. "You lost, son?" the man asked, his voice rough but kind. Keanu chuckled. "No, just thinking," he replied. The older man nodded, understanding. "Well, you look like you've got a lot on your mind." Keanu paused for a moment, looking down at the stream. "I guess I'm just trying to figure things out. You know, life and how to respond to things that come your way." The man sat down beside him, his gaze fixed on the water. "You can spend your whole life trying to figure things out, but the truth is we don't have control over everything. We only have control over how we respond." Keanu's eyes flickered up at the man. "What do you mean?" The man gave a small smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I mean that life throws us all kinds of curveballs. People say things, life gets tough. But what matters most is how we choose to deal with it. You can't always control what happens to you, but you can control your reaction. That's where your true power lies. Keanu reflected on the man's words. There it was, the answer he had been looking for. It wasn't about avoiding conflict or pretending like everything was okay. It was about being at peace with yourself, no matter what happened around you. The ability to remain calm and grounded, no matter how much chaos surrounded you, was where true strength came from. That night, Keanu sat by the fire, contemplating the conversation he'd had. He realized that this journey into the mountains wasn't just about finding peace in solitude. It was about finding peace within himself. The following morning, he packed up his things and headed back toward civilization, but with a renewed sense of clarity. The mountains had given him the space he needed to reflect, but now it was time to put those lessons into action. When he returned to Los Angeles, Keanu was different. The experience had changed him, not just in how he viewed the world, but in how he viewed himself. He had confronted the challenge of rising above conflict, but now he was ready for the next step of his journey, living in alignment with the values he held most dear. He wasn't just an actor. He wasn't just a public figure. He was a man, on a journey that for the first time in a long time felt true to who he really was. The path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but Keanu Reeves had learned something valuable on his journey, and he was ready for whatever came next. Keanu's return to Los Angeles was met with the usual fanfare, paparazzi snapping photos, reporters bombarding him with questions, and the hum of the city that never seemed to slow down. But for him, it all felt different. The noise, the chaos, the never-ending cycle of fame and recognition. It all seemed so distant now, like something he had once been a part of, but no longer felt connected to. As he drove through the busy streets of LA, Keanu thought about the lessons he'd learned up in the mountains. He had spent so much of his life navigating the highs and lows of fame, but now he was starting to realize that true peace didn't come from avoiding conflict or running from the pressures of the world. True peace came from facing those pressures head-on, from understanding that no amount of external validation could fill the void within. He had learned to deal with insults, mockery, and judgment, but the real test lay in how he would respond. When everything he held dear was put to the test, the moment came sooner than he expected. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon when the storm hit. Keanu had just returned to his home after a morning meeting with his manager when he opened his phone to see the headlines flash across his screen. The news, like wildfire, had spread quickly. Keanu Reeves was being publicly humiliated once again, this time by someone close to him. A former colleague, someone he had trusted and worked with for years, had suddenly turned on him. An explosive interview had hit the internet, where the colleague accused Keanu of being difficult to work with, of having an inflated ego, and of being a diva on set. The accusations were harsh and personal, and they cut deep, especially because it came from someone Keanu had considered a friend. It felt like a punch to the gut. His first instinct was to lash out, to defend himself, to prove that the accusations were false. But then he remembered the lessons he had learned in the mountains, the importance of how he responded to the world around him. He didn't need to prove anything. He had nothing to prove. Keanu spent the next few hours reflecting in silence, pacing around his house, unsure of what to do next. The emotional weight of the situation was heavy, but he knew he couldn't act out of anger. He needed to address it with calmness and clarity, just as he had done at the bar with the group of young men. As the evening approached, Keanu made a decision. He called a press conference. The media gathered at a studio in the city the next day, buzzing with anticipation. The story had been dominating headlines for hours, and now everyone wanted to hear Keanu's side. When he walked into the room, he was met with flashing cameras and the hum of eager reporters. He had been in similar situations before, but today felt different. Today he wasn't just an actor facing a scandal. Today, he was a man standing up for his integrity. Keanu took a deep breath and stepped up to the microphone, his expression calm, his voice steady. "I want to address the accusations made against me today," he began. "I've known colleagues' name for many years, and we've worked together on several projects. I consider them a friend, and it's difficult to hear these things, especially when they come from someone I trusted." The room was silent as Keanu continued, his words measured and deliberate. "I don't believe in airing dirty laundry or getting caught up in drama. My priority has always been to do my work to the best of my ability and to treat the people around me with kindness and respect. If I've ever come across as difficult or arrogant, I apologize. That was never my intention." He paused, glancing down at his hands before looking back up at the sea of reporters. "But I want to be clear. I'm not here to fight. I'm not here to defend myself against an attack. I'm here because I believe in accountability. And I believe that no matter what is said about me, my actions will speak louder than words." There was a brief moment of tension in the room. The reporters were waiting for something more, something juicy, something that would fuel the headlines. But Keanu wasn't interested in giving them that. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about this," he continued. "And while I don't agree with what's been said, I can't change the past. All I can do is move forward with integrity and continue to do the work I love." With that, he turned to leave the stage, his face calm and composed, but there was an undeniable weight in his eyes. The room was silent. The reporters left speechless, unsure of how to respond to his calm, resolute demeanor. As Keanu walked out of the press conference, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. The emotional storm of the past few days had been intense, but instead of letting it tear him down, he had faced it with the same quiet strength he had learned to cultivate. He wasn't defeated. He wasn't broken. He was standing firm, ready to face whatever came next. Later that night, as he sat alone in his living room, Keanu allowed himself to reflect on the journey he had been on. The trials, the struggles, the moments of doubt, all of it had brought him to this point. He had been tested both by others and by himself, but in the end, he had found the strength to rise above it. The phone buzzed on the table in front of him, and Keanu picked it up. A message from his manager. "Well handled today, you did the right thing, proud of you." Keanu smiled softly, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while he felt confident that whatever came his way, he would face it with the same grace and humility he had learned to embody. And as he set his phone down and looked out the window at the twinkling city lights, Keanu knew that his journey was far from over. The challenges were not behind him, but the lessons he had learned had already begun to shape the man he was becoming. In the days that followed Keanu's public response, the media frenzy slowly started to die down, but the whispers of his calm, composed nature persisted. His response to the scandal wasn't just a news story, it became something of a movement. People from all walks of life admired how he had taken the high road, how he'd refused to engage in the drama, instead choosing to stand on principle. His press conference was lauded for its maturity, and his fans rallied around him, expressing their support on social media, while others who had once been critical began to rethink their perceptions of him. But the question lingered in Keanu's mind. Was that enough? The easy thing would have been to retreat further into the background, to let things settle, and to fade back into the life of a quiet actor. But that wasn't the path he was meant to take. He had been given a chance to inspire, not just with his work but with his actions, and he realized that he wasn't just here to be a passive observer of the world. He could be more. He could do more. It wasn't long before Keanu received an unexpected invitation. It was a letter, handwritten, on simple, unembellished paper, the kind of letter that seemed out of place in the digital age. It came from a charity organization that worked with at-risk youth in Los Angeles, helping young people navigate the difficulties of their environment, empowering them to overcome obstacles and find hope where there seemed to be none. The letter explained that they were launching a new initiative, a mentorship program for young men who had faced significant adversity in their lives, with the goal of providing them with a positive role model and guidance to steer them away from the temptations of the streets. It was clear that Keanu's reputation as someone who could handle adversity with grace had not gone unnoticed. The organization was asking him to consider becoming a mentor, to share his story, his experiences, and to help guide these young men through their own struggles. At first, Keanu hesitated. He had never been one to seek the spotlight in such a personal way. He wasn't sure if he was the right person for the job. But as he thought about it more, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was his calling, his opportunity to make a tangible difference in the world. He remembered the conversations he'd had during his time in the mountains, the discussions about how the world's challenges could either break a person or transform them. He remembered the older man who had said that the most important thing was how you responded to life's curveballs. And this, Keanu realized, was his moment. He accepted the invitation. The day of his first visit to the program felt surreal. Keanu was greeted by the young men, their eyes wide with curiosity, as they saw the famous actor walk into the room. But Keanu wasn't there to impress them with his fame. He wasn't there to be their idol or their celebrity. He was there to connect with them as a person, not a persona. He sat down in front of the group, and for a moment there was an awkward silence. The young men who had grown up in tough neighborhoods and faced challenges that Keanu could only begin to understand seemed unsure of how to interact with him. Keanu, in turn, realized that while he had been through his own struggles, he couldn't pretend to know exactly what these kids had gone through. He broke the silence by simply saying, "I'm not here to give you some speech. I'm here to listen to your stories, to learn from you as much as you might learn from me." That's when things started to shift. One by one, the young men began to open up. They talked about the struggles they had faced, loss, poverty, violence, and how they had learned to cope with those struggles in unhealthy ways. But as they spoke, there was a spark in their eyes, a desire for something better, something more. Keanu listened intently, offering only the occasional word of encouragement or advice. He shared stories of his own challenges, of the times he had doubted himself or struggled to find his place in the world. He didn't try to glamorize his life, didn't pretend that his path had always been easy. Instead, he spoke about the importance of resilience, of finding strength in moments of weakness, and of the power of choosing one's own path in life, even when the world seems determined to push you in a different direction. As the meeting came to an end, Keanu stood up and looked at the young men. "I know it might feel like the odds are stacked against you sometimes," he said, his voice steady, but full of conviction. "But I also know that the greatest strength you can have is the strength to keep moving forward, to not let the world define you. You get to decide who you are, and you get to decide what your future looks like." There was a silence in the room, a powerful one, as the weight of his words settled in. And then something unexpected happened. One of the young men, a teenager with a tough exterior but a vulnerable look in his eyes, stood up and walked over to Keanu. Without saying a word, he extended his hand. Keanu, slightly surprised, took it. "I'm not sure I believe everything you said yet," the young man said quietly, "but I think I want to try." Keanu smiled, the gesture simple but powerful. "That's all I can ask for," he replied. As Keanu left the building that day, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't felt in years. This was what he had been searching for, not the validation of others, not the quiet peace of the mountains, but the deep satisfaction of knowing he had made a real difference in someone's life. This was the emotional turning point of Keanu's journey. No longer was he just an actor trying to navigate the challenges of fame. He had found a new purpose, a higher calling, and it felt right. The weeks following Keanu's involvement with the mentorship program brought about a transformation, not only in the lives of the young men he mentored, but in his own life as well. Keanu's decision to step into this new role, one far outside the scope of his typical Hollywood existence, had ignited something deep within him. He started looking at the world differently. The pressures of fame that had once consumed his every thought were no longer as important. What had once seemed like the most significant aspects of his life, his movies, his image, the red carpets and interviews, suddenly felt trivial in comparison to the connections he was building with these young men. Every session with the mentorship group was a revelation. The bond he was forming with the boys wasn't just about giving advice. It was about learning from them too. They too were navigating their own struggles, their own fights against the world and against themselves. Keanu realized that while he had chosen the path of fame, These young men were fighting to find a way out of their own personal battles, and through that, he began to understand what true leadership was, being a guide, but also being someone willing to show vulnerability, someone who was willing to walk beside them, not ahead of them. One particular day stood out. It was an early morning session, and Keanu had just arrived to meet with the group. He noticed that one of the teens, Chris, who had been relatively quiet during previous meetings, wasn't present. It wasn't unusual for someone to miss a meeting now and then, but this felt different. Keanu asked one of the other mentors, "Have you seen Chris this morning?" The mentor, a man who had worked in the program for years, shook his head. "I haven't. But his attendance has been a little shaky recently." Keanu's heart sank. He'd seen Chris struggle. The young man had come from a particularly tough background, and while he had shown immense potential, there were moments when he seemed to be teetering on the edge, unsure if he could truly overcome the life he'd known. Keanu didn't waste any time. He knew he had to find Chris to make sure he was okay. Without saying another word, he left the building and got into his car, heading straight to Chris's neighborhood. The area was rough, something Keanu knew all too well, having been raised in Toronto where he'd seen poverty up close. He parked his car at the edge of the street and walked towards the small rundown apartment building where Chris lived with his mother. The sounds of the street echoed in his ears, the chatter of kids playing, the distant sound of a car honking, the general hum of a community that had grown accustomed to hard times. As Keanu approached Chris's apartment, he was met by the young man's mother, a tired-looking woman in her mid-30s, who seemed to have weathered more than her fair share of storms. "Keanu, what brings you here?" she asked, her voice cautious but warm. "I'm looking for Chris," Keanu replied. "Is he here?" She looked down, shaking her head slowly. "He's been struggling lately. I think he might have run off. He was really upset this morning." Keanu felt a knot tighten in his chest. He had seen Chris lose hope before, but this felt different. The young man was on the edge of something, and Keanu knew it. He had to find him. After speaking briefly with Chris's mother, Keanu walked through the building, knocking on doors and asking neighbors if they had seen him. After a while, a voice called from the alley behind the building. "Keanu?" He turned, and there was Chris sitting on the curb, his face buried in his hands. Keanu took a step forward, his heart heavy. "Hey, Chris," Keanu said softly, sitting down next to him. "Mind if I join you?" Chris looked up, his face red from both frustration and tears. He didn't say anything at first, but after a long silence he spoke. "I don't know if I can do this anymore. I thought maybe this program was going to help me get out, but now, I don't know." His voice wavered. "I'm just so tired of being stuck. I don't know how to get out of here." Keanu sat quietly for a moment, letting the words sink in. He had been there before, not exactly in Chris's shoes, but he understood the overwhelming sense of being trapped in a situation that seemed impossible to change. "Life can feel really heavy sometimes," Keanu said, his voice quiet but firm. "And it can make you feel like you're walking through mud, but you don't have to do it alone." Chris looked at him, his eyes filled with skepticism. "It's not that simple, Keanu. You don't get it. You've got everything. You've got fame, money. I don't have any of that." Keanu nodded, understanding where Chris was coming from. "No, I don't have your life, and I don't have all the answers. But I do know this. None of that stuff is what's going to save you. It's not fame or money that's going to help you get out. It's you, and I'll be here to help however I can." There was a long pause, and then Chris spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know if I can do this, but maybe I'm willing to try." Keanu smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "That's all I can ask for, Chris. You don't have to have it all figured out, but as long as you keep moving forward, even if it's just one step at a time, you're already on the right path." The two of them sat there in silence for a while, watching the world go by. It was a small moment, a simple conversation, but for both of them it was a turning point. Keanu had known that this journey wouldn't be easy. He had known that it would be messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But it was moments like these that reminded him of why he had chosen to be a mentor in the first place. It wasn't about having all the answers. It wasn't about being perfect. It was about showing up, about being present when someone needed you most, and in that moment Keanu knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the weeks went by, Chris's situation improved. Slowly but surely, he began to open up more. During the mentorship sessions, his walls, built high over the years to protect him from a world that had constantly knocked him down, were starting to come down. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, moments when he would retreat back into old habits or pull away from Keanu's support. But Keanu was patient. He had learned that healing wasn't linear, and that sometimes it took time for the pieces to fall into place. But it wasn't just Chris who was going through a transformation. Keanu, too, was beginning to change. The more he worked with the program, the more he realized how much of his own life he had been taking for granted. Fame, wealth, success, they were fleeting things. But these young men, they had something he had lost sight of: resilience. Despite everything they had been through, they had the strength to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep dreaming. One evening, after a particularly difficult mentorship session where Chris had broken down in front of the group, Keanu found himself alone in his car parked outside the building. He stared out at the lights of the city, lost in thought. He had always been known as the calm, reserved Keanu Reeves, the one who could keep his cool no matter the situation. But tonight, he felt an unfamiliar weight pressing on his chest. The road ahead of him seemed long and uncertain. Sure, he had found purpose in helping these kids, but what did that mean for him in the long run? He had made a choice, one that was different from what his fans expected, different from what his career demanded, but it was a choice that felt right. But there was still a gnawing feeling in his gut. He wasn't sure he was ready to face the full scope of the journey he had embarked on. He was far from perfect, and perhaps even more imperfect than he realized. Suddenly, Keanu's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen to see a message from one of his close friends, John Wick co-director Chad Stahelski. "You okay, man?" Keanu smiled faintly. Chad had always been able to sense when something was off. He was one of the few people in Hollywood Keanu trusted implicitly, and he appreciated that Chad checked in on him, even if it was just a quick message. Keanu typed a quick reply. "Just thinking. A lot of things changing. Not sure if I'm ready for all of it." Almost immediately, Chad responded, "No one ever is, but you're doing the right thing, Keanu. You've got this." Keanu let out a long breath, his fingers hovering over the keys. For all the wisdom and confidence Chad exuded, Keanu still had his doubts. He had always known how to act, how to entertain, how to be the person the world expected him to be. But this was different. This was real. "Yeah," he typed back slowly. "I hope so." But just as he was about to put his phone down, a notification popped up on his screen. It was from the charity's coordinator, a woman named Angela. She was asking if he could meet with some of the youth again for a special event that they were organizing, a fundraiser to support the program's ongoing efforts. It was a simple request, but in that moment, it felt like the universe was calling him to step up even further. The pressure was mounting, and Keanu could feel it. But he wasn't sure if he was ready to take on this new challenge. He was still grappling with his own insecurities. He was still uncertain about whether he was the right person for the job. But as he sat there, reading Angela's message, he realized something. Maybe it didn't matter if he was ready. Maybe it was just about showing up. Keanu took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then typed his response. "I'll be there." The day of the fundraiser came quicker than Keanu expected. It was a grand event, high profile, with donors and influencers in attendance, all gathered to raise money for the youth mentorship program. Keanu was nervous. He had been to countless glamorous events in his life, but this was different. This wasn't about Hollywood. This was about the kids, about Chris and the others and their future. When he arrived at the venue, Keanu was greeted by a crowd of reporters, flashing cameras and the hum of conversations. It was a stark contrast to the low-key, intimate moments he had shared with the boys. Yet, there he was, standing in front of the cameras, realizing that all those years of being in the spotlight had prepared him for this moment. But it wasn't the fame that mattered. It was the message. Keanu took his place at the front of the room, the microphone in front of him. The crowd fell silent, and all eyes were on him. He cleared his throat, a little nervous but determined. "I've spent most of my life in front of cameras, playing roles that others expect me to play. But what I've come to learn is that the real role we all play is the one we choose for ourselves. I'm here today not as an actor, but as someone who has been inspired by the strength and resilience of the young men I've had the privilege of working with." The room was silent, listening intently. Keanu could see Chris standing near the back along with some of the other kids, their faces full of hope. "This program isn't about saving anyone," Keanu continued. "It's about giving these kids the tools they need to save themselves. I've learned more from them than I could ever teach. And if there's one thing I've realized, it's that no matter how hard life gets, as long as we don't give up on each other, we can overcome anything." The crowd erupted in applause, but Keanu barely heard it. His focus was entirely on the kids, who were watching him with wide eyes. They weren't seeing a famous actor. They were seeing someone who cared. And for Keanu, that was more than enough. The night of the fundraiser marked a pivotal moment in Keanu's journey. His words had resonated with the crowd, but it was the quiet moments that followed that truly struck him. As the event wrapped up, he found himself in a small corner of the room, surrounded by a few of the young men from the program, including Chris. They had gathered around him, their faces filled with gratitude, admiration, and something Keanu couldn't quite place. One by one, they approached him to offer their thanks. But it was Chris who surprised him the most. "Keanu," Chris said, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you really mean a lot to us. I don't think you realize how much you've changed things for me. You made me believe that I could do more than just survive. You made me believe I could thrive." Keanu felt a lump form in his throat. He had always prided himself on being reserved, on keeping his emotions in check. But in this moment, surrounded by the very people he had set out to help, he couldn't hold back. "You've got it in you, Chris," Keanu replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You always have. I just showed you where to look." The two shared a moment of understanding, a bond forged not through words but through shared experiences. In that moment, Keanu realized something he had never truly understood before. His fame, his fortune, his career, all of it had been a means to an end. The true purpose of his life wasn't to be a movie star or a household name. It was to use his platform to make a real difference in the lives of people like Chris, like the other boys in the program, and like countless others who needed a guiding hand. That night, Keanu went home with a renewed sense of purpose. The fame that had once weighed so heavily on him felt lighter, not because it had lost its significance, but because he now understood how to balance it with something more important: connection. He wasn't just a symbol of success anymore. He was someone who could make a tangible impact. But just as Keanu was beginning to believe that he had finally found the balance between his celebrity life and his new role as a mentor, life had other plans. A few days after the fundraiser, Keanu received an unexpected call. It was Angela, the program coordinator. She sounded panicked on the phone. "Keanu, we need you. There's been an incident with Chris. He's gone missing." Keanu's heart sank. It was a call he had feared but had hoped would never come. Chris, after everything, had been making progress. He had seemed so strong, so determined. What had happened? "I'm on my way," Keanu replied without hesitation. He wasted no time. Within minutes, he was back in his car, speeding toward the neighborhood where Chris had lived. His mind raced with questions. Had he fallen back into old habits? Was he running from something? Someone? As he arrived at the apartment complex, Keanu's eyes darted around. There was a police car parked outside, and a few of the other mentors were gathered near the entrance. He approached one of them, a woman named Sarah who had been close to Chris from the beginning. "We haven't heard anything," Sarah said, her face pale with concern. "But he hasn't answered any of our calls, and his mom says she hasn't seen him since yesterday. We're worried." Keanu nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settle into his chest. He couldn't let Chris slip through the cracks. He couldn't lose him. Not now, not after everything they had been through. "I'll go look for him," Keanu said firmly. "We'll find him. Don't worry." Keanu spent the next several hours searching the streets, talking to neighbors, and checking every corner of the neighborhood. He spoke to anyone who might have seen Chris, even asking the local shopkeepers if they had noticed anything unusual. There was no sign of him. As the sun began to set, Keanu's hope began to wane. He knew that Chris could be anywhere, and the longer he was missing, the harder it would be to find him. Just as he was about to give up and head back to the apartment to regroup, Keanu's phone buzzed. It was a message from Chris. "I don't know where to go. I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this." Keanu's heart tightened in his chest. He quickly typed a response. "Chris, you're not alone. I'm here. Just tell me where you are and I'll come get you." Minutes felt like hours as he waited for a reply. Finally, another message appeared. "Behind the old diner on 5th, I don't want to be a burden anymore. I can't do this." Keanu's stomach churned. It was clear that Chris was in a dark place, but Keanu refused to let him feel abandoned. He raced to the diner on 5th Street, his mind focused on one thing: finding Chris before it was too late. When Keanu arrived, he saw him, sitting on the curb, head bowed, shoulders slumped. It was a heartbreaking sight, but Keanu wasn't going to let Chris believe he was beyond help. He approached him slowly, gently, as if he were handling something fragile. "Chris," he said softly. The young man didn't look up. "I'm sorry. I messed everything up. I'm not good enough for this. I can't be what you want me to be." Keanu knelt down beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Chris, you're not messing anything up. You're allowed to struggle. You're allowed to have doubts. But I'm not going to give up on you, and neither should you." There was a long pause before Chris finally looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough." Keanu smiled softly, his voice calm but firm. "You don't have to be strong all the time. You just have to keep going, and I'll be right here with you. You're not alone in this." Chris took a shaky breath, then nodded, his body relaxing slightly. The two sat together in silence, and for the first time in days, Keanu felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could both get through this. The days following Chris's near breakdown were both challenging and cathartic. Keanu continued to check in with him regularly, supporting him with both his words and his actions. Chris, though still struggling, began to show signs of recovery. He came to terms with the idea that his journey wasn't a straight path, and sometimes taking one step forward meant slipping 2 steps back. But that wasn't failure. It was part of the process. In the weeks that followed, the mentorship program had a lasting impact, not only on Chris, but on the other young men as well. Keanu watched them grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. Their setbacks were real, but their victories, small as they might seem, were even more profound. Chris, in particular, began to show signs of true transformation. He joined the program's leadership team, helping to guide the new recruits. He even started a small project aimed at helping younger kids in the community, showing them the same care and mentorship that he had received. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable, but it wasn't just the kids who were changing. Keanu found himself starting to feel something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of fulfillment that came from more than just his movie roles. He began to see the world around him differently. Fame, once something that had burdened him, now seemed almost irrelevant. What mattered most was the connections he was building, the lives he was touching. One afternoon, while he was preparing for a meeting at the mentorship program's headquarters, Keanu received a call that would change his life forever. It was Angela, the program coordinator, and she had big news. "We've been invited to present the program at a national conference for youth empowerment," she said. "They've heard about the work we're doing, and they want us to be part of a panel discussion. This could open doors for more funding and support, and we think it's time we showcase the impact of the program, especially from your perspective, Keanu." Keanu took a moment to process. This was big. This was the opportunity to share everything they had worked so hard to build with a larger audience. It was a chance to make an even bigger impact. But as the reality of the invitation settled in, Keanu realized something. He wasn't just being invited because of his fame. He was being invited because the program had become more than just a cause to him. It had become his mission. "I'll do it," Keanu said with a calm certainty. "Let's do this. For them." The day of the conference arrived faster than Keanu had anticipated. It was being held in a large convention center in downtown Los Angeles, and as he entered the building, he was immediately struck by the energy in the air. It was buzzing with excitement, filled with activists, mentors, and other organizations, all gathered to discuss and present ways to empower youth across the country. Keanu, as the keynote speaker, was introduced to a packed room. He could feel the weight of the moment, but there was no fear. He wasn't standing in front of the audience as Keanu Reeves, the actor. He was standing as Keanu Reeves, the mentor, the guide, and the ally. He stepped up to the podium and smiled at the crowd, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Good afternoon," Keanu began, his voice steady and strong. "Today I stand before you not as a Hollywood actor, but as someone who has been truly humbled by the incredible strength and resilience I've witnessed in the young people I've had the honor of working with. The young men in this program, people like Chris and so many others, have shown me what it means to fight for your future, to keep going even when the world tells you it's too hard." The audience was silent, hanging on every word. "I've always been in front of cameras," Keanu continued, his gaze drifting to the young men who had come with him to the conference, playing characters, telling stories. "But what I've learned is that life isn't about the roles we play. It's about the people we choose to be, the choices we make when no one is watching. And the people who inspired me the most weren't the actors, musicians, or athletes. It was these kids, these young people, who've been through more than most of us can imagine, yet they continue to show up every day. They're the ones teaching me what real courage looks like." Keanu paused, looking out over the crowd. His heart was full, but there was no doubt in his mind that this was the moment he had been waiting for. Not the accolades, not the recognition, but the opportunity to make a difference. "And if I can help these young men," Keanu said, his voice breaking slightly with emotion, "then I believe anyone can. So if you take anything away from today, remember this: we all have the power to impact those around us. It's not about being perfect, it's about being present." The room erupted into applause, but Keanu wasn't focused on the praise. Instead, he looked back at the group of young men who had been by his side through it all. They were all standing together, proud and strong, having come so far from where they had started. In that moment, Keanu realized something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. This was the real purpose of it all, helping others, lifting them up, and making a lasting impact. It was a mission far greater than any film role could ever be. As the applause died down and the panel discussion began, Keanu felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The path he had chosen, though challenging, had brought him to this point, and he was ready to continue the journey, not as an actor, not as a star, but as a mentor, a guide, and a witness to the resilience of the human spirit. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?